Okay, welcome to today's episode of Legally Noirette, Legally Raven Haired. As always, this is going to be an editing video, which is why we're not in screen share mode. We are today going to talk about a concept on the MBE exam. That concept is standard of care. So, standard of care, we need to go up a few levels. So, we're talking about torts. We're talking about the tort of negligence. We're talking about one of the elements of negligence, duty of care. Okay, so now that we have that settled, let's talk about what is a tort. Torts are legal wrongs that one party suffers at the hands of another. And there are three types of tort. There is an intentional tort, where someone intentionally commits a wrong and causes injury to someone else. There is a negligent tort, where someone violated a duty they owe to the person harmed, such as running a red light and causing an accident. And then there's strict liability torts, where it does not matter whether there is an intent or duty is breached, the defendant is liable because the matter is so important. So strict liability typically applies to product liability. For example, if a defective product caused an injury, then the manufacturer or store that sold it could be held liable. All right, now when we talk about negligence, because that's what we're going to talk about today, there are four elements: duty of care, breach of that duty, causation, and then the damages. So when we talk about standard of care, this is part of the duty. In tort law, the standard of care is only the degree of prudence and caution required of an individual who is under a duty of care. So this is an objective standard. So an objective standard is one that's based on factual measurements and absence of biased judgment or analysis. So it uses the standard of a reasonable person to determine whether someone acted negligently in causing an accident. Is an example of an objective standard because it does not require analysis of the mindset of the person. All right. When writing essays for the bar exam, I know we were talking about MBE, but when we talk about the MEE, be sure not to include any subjective material when answering essays. The bar examiners do not want to see that. Now, when we talk about the standard of care, it's really an essential concept in determining whether a person was negligent, and if they were negligent, could be potentially liable for this tort or wrong that they committed against the person. If a person breaches the standard that applies to them, and their actions cause harm to another person, they will be liable for negligence. So, what is this reasonable person standard? The standard of care usually revolves around the concept of a reasonable person, whether someone acted with care as an average person would have been in those circumstances. In some circumstances, the concept applies very easily. So, one example I saw was that if you take a medication and then you drive, if 1 in 50 people are drowsy after taking this medication, then a prudent person would not drive. But if it was 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100,000 and a person decided to drive, well, then here you have it. A reasonable person probably would think, what are the chances that I'm going to be one of those people? And so therefore, they might decide to then drive and not be a violation or a breach of that standard of care, and therefore not be liable for a tort. Whereas a person where it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 50 or maybe even 1 in 100 people will be drowsy, likely are taking a bigger risk in engaging in the activity of driving than a reasonable person would than a reasonable person would do. And so therefore it will be a breach of the duty of standard of care. Now, what is the reasonable person? We have Kramer here from Seinfeld, and then we have Monk, right? Neither of these would probably be an example of what we would think is a reasonable person. And for a Seinfeld analogy, we probably would think of maybe Elaine or actually Jerry as being more of a reasonable person. Kramer was always getting himself in scrapes. Now we have Monk, on the other hand, who is obsessively compulsive. And so his standard of care would also not be that of a reasonable person, right? When we're trying to figure out what is the reasonable person. Another thing we want to talk about is children and reasonable standard of care. Children generally are not held to the same reasonable standard of care as adults unless the child is participating in an adult activity. So when we look here, we have Dr. Fauci, right? Okay, he's going to be held to a higher standard of care than a reasonable person because he is a doctor. So when we look at professionals, whether it's doctors, lawyers, engineers, nurses, right? They have additional education that is going to give them knowledge and therefore responsibility greater than that of a reasonable person. So when we look at them being liable maybe for malpractice or something like that, they're not going to be compared to another reasonable person. They're going to be compared to another doctor or another lawyer or another engineer. The reasonable standard is that of a reasonable person in their profession with their knowledge. One thing to know is that once you become a lawyer, for instance, even if you're brand new and you're just past the bar, you now are held to the same standard of care as a lawyer who's been a lawyer for 500 years. Okay, we know no one's been a lawyer for 500 years, but that's the point. Once you get that piece of paper, you are held for the same standard. Now, is that true in the medical profession? I'm not sure, but in the legal profession, as far as I understand it, it is. Okay, now let's look at Doogie Howser here. I'm aging myself by Doogie Howser, but I grew up on this TV show. Doogie Howser was a kid. I think he was 11, 12, 13. I can't remember how old he was when the show started, but the point was he was a doctor. Now, Doogie Howser, his malpractice is going to be the same as Dr. Fauci's because he is a child that is participating in an adult activity. And so that's where children need to be careful. Now, one thing that I felt interesting, and I spelled this word wrong, so let's get it right. Disabilities. Okay. Reasonable care and disabilities. So when we look at reasonable care, we're looking at depression, right? When we talk about depression or any type of mental disability, they are held at the same, it's held as at the same, that's not considered when we talk about reasonable standard of care. Okay. Depression is just viewed as depression. So if you are depressed, there isn't going to be, it's not going to say, what would a reasonable depressed person do in this situation? No, you're still just considered a reasonable person. However, physical disabilities, if you're deaf, if you're blind, if you're paralyzed or in a wheelchair, it will become, what would a reasonable blind person do in this situation? What would a reasonable deaf person do in this situation? What would a reasonable paralyzed person do in this situation? So that's something that we have to consider when it comes to what is a reasonable standard of care. So hope you enjoyed this short video. Once again, this short video is helping us understand the MBE concept of standard of care, and we need to go a few levels up. Standard of care is a duty, which is part of negligence, which is one of the 4 elements of negligence. And negligence is one of the 3 types of tort. And a tort is a legal wrong that one party suffers at the hands of another. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Legally Noirette, Legally Raven here. Once again, we are being sponsored by Bar Exam Drills. Bar Exam Drills is a great way that you can drill over 2,000 MBE questions, and it has great videos to help you understand concepts. Many people spend a lot of time watching lectures and things like that, and they don't spend enough time really answering questions. And then as you get better at it, in a timed environment, the challenge is that it's like buying a whole bunch of magazines about exercise, buying a whole bunch of gym equipment, and they are watching a whole bunch of videos on YouTube, but never getting off the couch and actually participating in the activity. So Bar Exam Drills, that is only $999. It is a great value. You can do it anywhere on your phone. I highly recommend it. Just jump in there and start answering questions and understanding these bar exam concepts. Thank you today for tuning into Legally Noirette. Legally Raven here. See you next time. Bye-bye.